All right. Well, Hala and the gang, I can't thank you enough for letting me come here at distance here. So from Washington, D.C., I say hello. I can't tell you the regret I have not being there in person. And the only thing that mitigates the sadness I have of not being there with you all is the total awe and euphoria I have. I've been following this over the last day on Twitter. It just seems like an extraordinary event. I was out this morning with some interesting people who are thinking a lot about the ecosystem over there here in the United States, and I was describing to folks this great event, and they're just blown away by, I think, a lot of what's going on in Egypt right now. And I really, rather than be too specific, in terms of advice on how to run companies, I thought maybe I would just reflect and wrapping up on a few things that I've been seeing, which are kind of interesting. And so they're in awe that this whole event is going on overall. The substance of you all as entrepreneurs, are incredibly impressive to the people here. The mind-blowing panels that you've come and brought to bear today, I think, have been unbelievable. And it's a who's who of sponsors, which even 2 or 3 years ago, I'm not sure that we would have seen overall. The news about the Greek campus, the news about what AUC is doing in terms of what it's building overall, and now Cairo Angels getting into the fray with Hossam Hassanein joining so many other people and raising money here. I mean, this is a really historic moment that I think that we find ourselves in. And I think about the journey of my writing the book over the last 2 years, with all the ups and downs which have obviously happened in the region and around the world, and yet the entrepreneurship is moving so interestingly and wonderfully in Egypt and very powerful. And I think it's great. And I think people, particularly over here in Silicon Valley and New York, lose track of one of the great truisms that they've lived in their lives in many ways, which is the science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke has this wonderful line that tech revolutions are most often underestimated in the long run. And I think, quite frankly, what is happening in emerging growth markets generally, in the Middle East generally, but in Egypt in particular, is really the long run right now. I think it's an incredibly powerful thing. I think we like to get lost in the stories that tell us otherwise. This is one of the great cautions that I give to every entrepreneur. We all like to believe our own stories. We all like stories because they allow us to act in what we think about, I think, in many powerful ways. But the problem is when you get into a story, you can get stuck in a story. And in the case of the West and the United States, we're stuck in one story about Egypt right now, and we're not looking at the evidence of what you folks are building in very powerful ways, and thus I think we're missing opportunity. We as entrepreneurs can get stuck in believing our own stories, and in so doing, we can actually miss opportunities for us to pivot our companies or evolve in very, very powerful ways. I'm sure you saw recent coverage. There's a pretty famous article over here about the great entrepreneur, who is inventing effectively some of the greatest online education companies here. And Sebastian Frum has been criticized because he's actually looking at the data very hard in his education startup, and he's learning things in the data that don't fit his story. And so people are therefore concluding here that maybe his story is no good, whereas Musk is doing exactly what we should always be doing all the time, which is looking at the data, questioning what we're doing, questioning our own stories, because in that, the macro opportunity and the revolution in our hands may still be there, but how we approach it, is going to be, I think, profoundly important. Why do we get stuck in our stories overall? I think usually because we have evidence that our stories are right. But I think mostly we get stuck in our own stories because at the end of the day we really think comfort in just believing what we want to believe in very, very powerful things. And I think the biggest trends at a more macro level that are being missed in your region right now are really fourfold. And I think the first is I interviewed in the book, some of the largest mobile carriers in Egypt, and every one of them said to me that within the next 3, now 2 years, there's going to be 50% smartphone penetration in Egypt. And as many as you know, that penetration has been surpassed in other parts of the Middle East already. Mark Andreessen, who's the great founder of the browser and of Netscape and the great venture capitalist of Andreessen Horowitz, wrote in the foreword of my book, he thinks in the next 8 years there are going to be 5 billion smartphones on the planet. And I think, again, stuck in our narrative, we tend to think, well, that means there are just better phones out there, or there are better ways to get video and better opportunities for entertainment, all of which I think is true. But I think what most people certainly here miss, I will suggest to you that the folks who created BlackBerry completely miss, is that these devices are not merely highfalutin telephones, but they really are, at the end of the day, incredibly powerful supercomputers. And when entire markets have 50%, 60%, 70% of human beings walking around with supercomputers in their pockets, that's unbelievably powerful. And the second thing is the technology that everyone has access to really works. I mean, even 3 to 5 years ago, so much software was buggy, but now it's such a powerful thing. And the third thing to keep in mind is that while I know capital is slow to come to startups, particularly in the A round, we do have now 2 decades of amazing global experience in funding all sorts of companies in emerging markets that have faced as many, and I would argue in some cases more challenges than Egypt faces today. And I think that means that as other emerging markets rise into the entrepreneurship area, with that experience, with that expertise, things are only going to move faster. And finally, I would say, and this is particularly about Egypt overall, and this goes to all the business executives I meet there with all the warnings and cautions of the challenges are there too, that there's just a pent-up talent and pent-up demand for opportunity that I think people are just waiting on the sidelines looking at this with a tremendous level of seriousness, both there and I think around the world and certainly in the West. We all know what the headwinds look like. About political instability and rule of law. You guys live the challenges of WASTA. You live the challenges of getting the capital when you get through that first round to the A round. But all I can tell you is, unlike 6 months ago, people are raising capital, looking to work around things, I think, in very, very powerful ways. I can't predict the future of Egypt in the next 6 months or 3 years. None of us can. None of us have crystal balls. But I can tell you with 100% certainty that you're on the right side of history, that there's going to be a lot more people there in the region with technology that we have now. And we all know that when people have access to technology that works, there is no going back. And as I reported throughout Egypt in my book, probably the most regular quote I heard from people is, there is no going back. This is true, I think, at the macro level. History will have to prove it's true. But it's absolutely true at the micro level with the entrepreneurs like you guys who are building such powerful things. So I think the most fundamental question that any entrepreneur can be asking in any market, in any circumstance, is what is the next 5 years going to look like in terms of how will it be different? Again, not in terms of a crystal ball, but we know that certain things are happening now that will be different in the next 5 years to the last 5 years. So many business executives, so many people think that the last 5 years will be like the next 5 years, but it is never the case. And everything that you guys have been building and been talking about in the last 24 hours I think has been unbelievably powerful in really focusing on what's going to be different in the next 5 years as opposed to what might be the same from before. And in that lies the most remarkable opportunities and I think genuine ecosystems at their core which have been built anywhere around the world. So Hala, it's an honor to be here, and I'm just thrilled to be watching what you guys have been doing in the last 24 hours, and thanks for letting me come on just for a few minutes at the end.